I turned my pickup onto the narrow mountain road, the worn tires crunching against loose gravel as I made the ascent toward my new life. The Great Smoky Mountains loomed ahead, their peaks disappearing into wisps of the fog that gave them their name. 6 hours of driving had left me stiff, but there was something freeing about putting distance between myself and Nashville. The divorce papers had been finalized just 3 weeks ago. Lily had wanted to find herself, without me. The accounting firm letting me go a month later felt like the universe piling on. But now I saw it differently. A clean break, a chance to start over. My truck groaned as I navigated a particularly steep section. The old Ford had seen better days, but it was one of the few things I'd fought to keep in the divorce. Not that Lily had wanted it anyway. I rolled down the window, letting the cool mountain air fill my lungs. Pine and earth and something wild that city air never carried. For the first time in months, I felt a flutter of hope in my chest. 6 months as a park ranger in near-complete isolation was exactly what I needed. The GPS lost signal about 20 minutes back, but Leonard's hand-drawn map kept me on track. The sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the road as I continued climbing. The forest grew thicker on either side, trees pressing close to the narrow road like silent observers. I spotted a small wooden sign with faded lettering. Ranger Station 17. Turning onto an even narrower dirt road, I followed it another mile until the trees opened to reveal a small clearing. A modest log cabin sat in the center, smoke curling from its chimney. My new home. I parked beside an older model Forest Service truck and killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound. No traffic, no neighbors, no sounds of civilization at all. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and distant bird calls. As I stepped out of my truck, the cabin door opened. A man emerged, tall, weathered, with military short gray hair and the rigid posture of someone who'd spent decades in uniform. He didn't smile as he approached. "Bryson Weber?" he asked, his voice gruff. "That's me," I said, extending my hand. "You must be Leonard Ross." He shook my hand firmly, his palm calloused. "Made good time. Wasn't expecting you till full dark. Traffic was lighter than I expected." Leonard nodded, his eyes scanning me like he was conducting an assessment. Whatever he saw didn't seem to impress him much. "Got your stuff? I'll help you bring it in before I head back down." I grabbed my duffel bag and 2 boxes from the truck bed, all I'd brought for 6 months in isolation. Leonard raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. A main room served as both living area and kitchen, with a wood stove in one corner. A short hallway led to what I assumed was a bedroom and bathroom. The walls were lined with maps, wildlife guides, and equipment. "Radio desk is there," Leonard said, pointing to a setup near the window. "Computer's ancient but works for reports. Generator out back for power, but use it sparingly. Solar panels handle basic needs when weather cooperates." I set my things down on a worn sofa. "Thanks. I've reviewed all the training materials, but if there's anything specific to this station..." Leonard's expression darkened. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This wasn't in your training packet." I took the paper, unfolding it to find a typed list with a handwritten title. Station 17 Rules. "What's this?" I asked, scanning the first few items. Leonard crossed his arms. "Rules specific to this location. Follow them exactly. No exceptions." I read through the list, my confusion growing with each item. 1. Do not follow voices at night, no matter who they sound like. 2. Do not investigate crying sounds after sunset. 3. If you see a second version of yourself, do not acknowledge it in any way. There were more, equally bizarre. I looked up at Leonard, waiting for the punchline. Is this some kind of initiation joke? Scare the new guy? Leonard's face remained stone serious. "No joke, Weber. These rules keep you alive up here. I laughed nervously. Come on. This is folklore stuff, right? Local legends to spook tourists? Aiden Garrison thought the same thing. Leonard's voice was flat. Aiden? The ranger I'm replacing? Leonard nodded once. He decided some rules were meant to be broken. Been missing 3 months now. My smile faded. Missing? Like lost on a trail. We searched every inch of his patrol area. Twice. No trace. Leonard tapped the paper in my hand. He ignored rule number 3, reported seeing himself standing at the tree line one evening. Next morning, his cabin was empty. Radio, wallet, keys, all still there. A chill ran down my back that had nothing to do with the mountain air. You can't seriously believe. Don't much care what you believe, Leonard cut me off. Just follow the rules. Check in by radio every morning at 8 and every evening at 6. Report anything unusual during daylight hours only. After dark, stay inside unless absolutely necessary. I folded the paper, unsure how to respond. Part of me still thought this was an elaborate prank, but Leonard's intensity was unsettling. Got it, I said finally. Follow the rules, check in twice daily. Leonard nodded, seemingly satisfied. He handed me a set of keys. Cabin, truck, storage shed. Supplies come once a month. Next delivery in 2 weeks. He walked to the door, then paused. One more thing. If you decide to leave before your 6 months are up, radio first. I'll come get you. Don't try to drive down the mountain alone after experiencing anything unusual. With that cryptic warning, he left. I stood in the doorway, watching his truck disappear down the road until the rumble of its engine faded completely. The silence that followed was absolute. I closed the door and turned back to my new home. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the shadows in the corners deeper. I unfolded the rules list again, reading through the bizarre instructions more carefully. This is ridiculous, I muttered to myself, but I didn't throw the list away. Instead, I pinned it to the corkboard above the radio desk. I spent the next hour unpacking my meager belongings. Clothes in the bedroom dresser, toiletries in the small bathroom, books on the shelf beside the sofa, my laptop on the desk, though Leonard had warned the internet connection was spotty at best. The kitchen was already stocked with basic supplies, canned goods, rice, pasta, coffee. I made myself a simple dinner and ate at the small table by the window, watching darkness settle over the forest. As night fell completely, the woods outside transformed. What had seemed peaceful in the fading light now looked impenetrable, a wall of black beyond the small circle of light from the cabin windows. I found myself thinking about the rules, about voices in the night and crying sounds and doppelgangers at the tree line. Get it together, Bryson, I said aloud, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet cabin. It's just forest folklore. I washed my dishes and prepared for bed, trying to focus on the positives. No more fighting with Lily, no more awkward encounters with former colleagues, no more sleepless nights staring at the ceiling of my empty apartment. Just peace, quiet, and a chance to rebuild. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a double bed and a window overlooking the clearing. I left the window cracked open, letting in cool night air and the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional owl, the rustle of leaves. As I lay in bed, I couldn't help glancing at the rules list I'd brought with me from the main room. It sat on the nightstand, its warnings seeming both absurd and ominous in the darkness. Complete isolation, I reminded myself. That's what I had signed up for. That's what I needed. I just hadn't expected it to come with a set of supernatural warnings. I spent my first 3 days at Station 17 settling into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. The morning patrol routes took me along ridge lines with views that stretched for miles across the Great Smoky Mountains. Afternoons were for checking trail conditions, clearing fallen branches, and documenting wildlife sightings in the station logbook. Each task on Leonard's checklist gave me something concrete to focus on, something real and tangible, after months of my life feeling like it was slipping through my fingers. The isolation hit different out here. Back in Nashville, being alone in my apartment after Lily left had felt like drowning in silence. Here, the forest was never truly quiet. Birds called, leaves rustled, and small creatures scurried through underbrush. The constant background noise of nature made the solitude feel almost companionable rather than empty. On my second day, I hiked the eastern boundary trail, stopping to repair a section of fence that had collapsed under a fallen pine. The physical labor left my muscles pleasantly sore, so different from the neck and back pain I'd developed hunching over spreadsheets at my accounting job. That night I slept better than I had in months, with no thoughts of missed alimony payments or job applications. By the third day, I found myself thinking less and less about Leonard's bizarre rules. The list still hung above my radio desk where I'd pinned it, but I'd stopped glancing at it every time I passed. The warnings about voices, crying children, and doppelgangers seemed increasingly absurd in the daylight. The forest felt welcoming, not threatening. I began to suspect that Leonard's warnings were just an initiation ritual, a way to haze the new guy with spooky campfire stories. I even caught myself smiling as I radioed in my evening check-in, reporting on a family of deer I'd spotted near the creek and the weather conditions that promised clear skies for the next few days. Leonard responded with his usual clipped acknowledgments, asking nothing about strange occurrences. Why would he? There weren't any. That night I made a simple dinner of pasta with canned sauce, read a few chapters of a thriller I'd brought along, and turned in early, looking forward to exploring the western trails in the morning. I woke suddenly in the darkness, my heart already racing before my mind caught up to what had pulled me from sleep. Bryson, please help me. The voice came from outside, faint but unmistakable. Lily's voice. I sat bolt upright, disoriented. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2:17 in the morning. The cabin was dark, except for moonlight filtering through my bedroom window. Bryson, I'm hurt. Please, I need help. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the window, pulling aside the curtain. Nothing but darkness greeted me, the clearing around the cabin barely visible in the moonlight, the forest beyond an impenetrable wall of black. Lily? I called out, my voice cracking. Bryson! Thank God! I got lost hiking. I fell. My ankle. I can't walk. Her voice came from somewhere at the tree line, wavering and desperate. Please, I need help. My mind raced. Lily was in Nashville, not here. She hated hiking. She'd never even been to the Smokies with me during our marriage. There was no logical reason for her to be outside my cabin at 2 in the morning. And yet, it was her voice. The same voice that had whispered, I love you every night for 5 years before we fell asleep. The same voice that had later said, I can't do this anymore, across our kitchen table. I turned and grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand, already reaching for my boots by the door. I'm so cold, Bryson. Please hurry. The voice broke into sobs that twisted something in my chest. My hand froze on the doorknob. Rule number 1, never follow voices at night. I stood paralyzed, torn between instinct and instruction. The voice outside, Lily's voice, continued calling, growing more frantic. Bryson, why aren't you coming? Don't you care that I'm hurt? I can see the light in your window. I know you're in there. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. This couldn't be happening. Lily was in Nashville. This wasn't real. Please, I whispered to myself, please stop. Bryson, something's coming. I can hear it in the trees. Help me. The terror in her voice sounded so genuine, so raw. My hands shook as I pressed them against my ears. It's not real, I told myself, backing up until my shoulders hit the wall. It's not Lily. The voice changed then, subtly at first. The pitch rose slightly. The cadence shifted. "Bryson," it called, drawing out my name unnaturally. "I'm dying out here. Your fault. Your fault." I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, still pressing my hands against my ears, but it didn't help. The voice seemed to bypass my ears entirely, vibrating directly inside my skull. "Let me in, Bryson. Let me in, let me in, let me in." The words began to overlap, echoing and multiplying until it sounded like a chorus of lilies were calling from the forest, their voices layering over each other in impossible ways. Then came the sounds no human throat could make, high-pitched keening that broke into wet, gurgling noises, followed by a deep, resonant hum that made the windows vibrate. The sounds twisted together, rising and falling in patterns that felt almost like language, but were nothing I could understand. I curled into myself, knees pulled to my chest, eyes squeezed shut. Time stretched as the inhuman sounds continued, sometimes retreating into the distance before rushing back to press against the cabin walls like a physical force. When my alarm beeped at 6, the noise stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical shock. I raised my head from my arms, realizing I'd spent the rest of the night huddled against the wall. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Birds chirped outside, normal morning sounds that felt obscene after the night's horrors. I stood on shaky legs and approached the window cautiously. The clearing looked exactly as it had yesterday, undisturbed, peaceful in the morning light. No footprints, no sign that anything had been there at all. I made coffee with trembling hands, spilling grounds on the counter. As the pot brewed, I stared at the rule list pinned above the radio. 1. Never follow voices at night. I thought about Aiden Garrison, the missing ranger whose cabin this had been. Had he heard voices too? Had he followed them into the darkness? I picked up the radio handset, my finger hovering over the call button. I could tell Leonard what happened. Ask him what the hell was going on here. But what would I say? That I heard my ex-wife's voice in the forest, that it turned into something inhuman. He'd think I was cracking under the isolation. Or worse, he'd believe me, which meant accepting that whatever happened last night was real. I set the handset down without making the call. Instead, I poured my coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the sun climb higher above the trees. The forest looked beautiful and peaceful in the morning light, showing no trace of the nightmare that had unfolded hours before. I'd been so quick to dismiss Leonard's warnings as folklore. 3 peaceful days had been enough to convince me I knew better than the rules that had been established who knows how long ago. Now I understood. The rules weren't a joke or an initiation ritual. They were a survival guide. And I had 5 more months to survive. I nearly convinced myself the voice had been a hallucination. 2 weeks of normal forest sounds at night had dulled the memory of that terrifying experience. I'd settled into my ranger duties with a comfortable routine, hiking trails during daylight hours, maintaining the station, and making my scheduled radio check-ins with Leonard. The rules stayed pinned above my radio desk, but I'd stopped looking at them quite so often. That changed around midnight on my 17th night at Station 17. I was reading in bed when I heard it, the unmistakable wail of an infant crying somewhere in the forest. The sound cut through the usual night chorus of crickets and distant owl hoots, making me sit bolt upright. "What the hell?" I whispered, setting my book aside. I listened more intently. There it was again, a baby crying, the sound wavering and desperate. It seemed to come from the eastern side of the clearing, toward the denser part of the forest. I got out of bed and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out. The moonlight cast everything in pale blue light, but I couldn't see anything moving near the tree line. Just dark trunks and deeper shadows beyond. The crying continued, rising to a desperate pitch that made my stomach tighten. It sounded so real, a helpless infant, alone in the wilderness at night. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and hurried to the front door, snatching my jacket from its hook as I passed. My hand was on the doorknob when something made me pause. The rules. Leonard's rules. Rule number 2. Never investigate crying sounds after sunset. My hand froze on the knob as the memory of those typed words hit me like cold water. The crying outside grew louder, seeming to shift position. Now it sounded like it was coming from the south side of the cabin. I backed away from the door, flashlight still gripped in my hand. The baby's cries grew more frantic, more desperate. How could I just ignore that? What kind of person would I be? It's not real, I told myself, though my racing heart suggested otherwise. It can't be real. I moved to the south window and looked out. Nothing there but trees and darkness. Yet the sound was crystal clear, a baby crying its lungs out, as if it were right outside my window. Then the crying shifted again, now coming from the west side of the cabin. I walked around the main room, following the sound as it moved. My paternal instincts screamed at me to go outside, to find this child, to help. I'd always wanted kids. Lily hadn't. It had been one of our many points of contention. The crying grew more insistent, more heart-wrenching. I paced back and forth across the cabin, my fists clenched at my sides. "This isn't happening," I said aloud, trying to drown out the sound with my own voice. This isn't real. But it felt real. It sounded real. The cries had the distinctive pattern of an infant, the gasping inhale, the wailing exhale, the moments of quiet before starting again. I stopped at the front door once more, my hand hovering over the knob. The crying now seemed to come from directly outside. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard it clearly. A baby, right on my doorstep. Jesus, I muttered, pulling back. I thought about Aiden Garrison, the missing ranger. Had he heard these same cries? Had he stepped outside to investigate, breaking the rules? Was that why he disappeared? The crying shifted position again, now coming from the north side of the cabin. I moved to that window and looked out, seeing nothing but darkness. The sound was maddening. A baby in distress, moving impossibly around my cabin. I retreated to the center of the main room and sat on the couch, pressing my hands over my ears. It didn't help. The crying penetrated my fingers, my skull, settling directly into my brain. I stood up again, unable to stay still. I paced the length of the cabin back and forth, while the crying continued to circle outside. It would fade slightly, then grow louder, as if whatever carried the infant was walking around the perimeter of the clearing. Not real, I repeated to myself. Not real. Hours passed. I checked my watch. 2 in the morning, then 3, then 4. The crying never stopped, never faltered. Sometimes it seemed miles away. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming through the very walls of the cabin. I tried everything to distract myself. I turned on the small TV, but the static only made things worse. I tried reading, but couldn't focus on the words. I made coffee, though I didn't need the caffeine with adrenaline already coursing through my system. At one point, the crying seemed to come from directly beneath the floorboards. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the wooden floor. It sounded like the baby was under the cabin, wailing up at me through the foundation. I backed away, my heart pounding. That's not possible, I said aloud. By 5 in the morning, I was a wreck. I'd been up all night, pacing, listening, fighting every instinct to go outside and search for the source of those cries. My hands shook as I made another pot of coffee I didn't need. Then, just as the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, the crying stopped. One moment it was there, a desperate wailing infant somewhere outside my north window, and the next, silence. The sudden absence of sound was almost as jarring as the crying had been. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, listening. Nothing but the normal pre-dawn forest sounds, a few early birds, the rustle of leaves in the light breeze. I waited 10 minutes, then 20. The crying didn't return. When the sun finally rose, I grabbed my jacket, flashlight, and station-issued binoculars. I had to check. Rules or no rules, I needed to know if there had been something or someone out there. I started at the front door, scanning the dirt for footprints. Nothing but my own boot prints from yesterday's patrol. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking the ground for any sign of disturbance. The morning dew had settled on the grass, unbroken except where my feet now passed. I expanded my search, moving into the tree line. I looked for broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, anything that might indicate someone had passed through during the night. Nothing. I spent the entire morning searching, widening my circle with each pass. I checked every possible hiding place within a quarter mile of the cabin. I looked for tracks, for cloth caught on branches, for anything that might explain what I'd heard. There was nothing. No evidence anyone had been near my cabin in weeks, let alone last night with an infant. By noon, I had to accept the truth. Whatever I'd heard wasn't human, at least not in any normal sense. It had moved too quickly around the cabin, had come from too many impossible locations. No real person could have carried a baby in complete silence, leaving no tracks, while the child wailed loudly enough to wake me through closed windows. I returned to the cabin, exhausted and unsettled. I washed my face in the bathroom sink, staring at my reflection in the small mirror. Dark circles had formed under my eyes from the sleepless night. My face looked gaunt, worried. I walked to the radio desk and looked at the rules pinned to the corkboard. Rule number 2 stared back at me. Never investigate crying sounds after sunset. I'd followed the rule. Barely. I'd wanted so badly to go outside, to find that crying baby. But I'd stayed inside, and now, in the light of day, I was grateful I had. I sat at the desk, wondering if I should tell Leonard about what happened during our scheduled check-in. But what would I say? That I'd heard a ghost baby circling my cabin all night? That something inhuman had tried to lure me outside? No. He'd either think I was losing my mind or worse, confirm that these things were real. I wasn't ready for either response. I made myself lunch, though I wasn't hungry. I needed to do something normal, something routine. As I ate, I stared out the window at the peaceful forest. In daylight, it looked so ordinary, so unthreatening. But I knew better now. I knew what waited in those trees after dark. I gradually adjusted to the bizarre nighttime disturbances after spending a month at the ranger station. Following the rules had become second nature, even when it meant pressing my hands over my ears while something that sounded exactly like a lost child circled my cabin for hours, or ignoring a voice that perfectly mimicked my ex-wife begging for help. The isolation helped in a way. With no one around to witness my fear or question my sanity, I settled into a rhythm of normalcy during daylight hours and white-knuckled endurance after sunset. I'd wake up exhausted but alive, which seemed like victory enough. My morning and evening radio check-ins with Leonard became anchors in my routine. I'd sit at the desk, adjust the frequency, and report only what he needed to hear. Station 17 to base, morning check-in. All trails clear, weather mild, spotted 3 deer near the eastern ridge. Over. Leonard would respond with the same professional tone. Base to 17, received. Continue monitoring the eastern section for any fallen trees after last night's wind. Over. I never mentioned the voices. Never described the crying. Never asked if he heard them too when he worked here. The rules were clear, and something told me that speaking about these things might make them worse. During my 4th week, I hiked the full perimeter of my patrol area, marking trail conditions on my map and clearing minor debris. The physical work helped keep my mind occupied and my body tired enough that I sometimes managed a few hours of actual sleep before the nightly disturbances began. I fell into a pattern of cooking simple meals, reading until I couldn't focus anymore, then bracing myself for whatever might come after dark. Some nights were quiet, others weren't. That evening, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dinner dishes while the sun dipped below the tree line. The mundane task felt almost comforting, something normal in a place that was anything but. I scrubbed at a stubborn bit of dried pasta sauce on my plate, thinking about nothing in particular. A flicker of movement caught my eye through the kitchen window. I looked up, expecting to see a deer or maybe a raccoon venturing into the clearing. My hands froze mid-scrub. There, at the edge of the forest, stood a man. Not just any man. Me. I blinked hard, but the image remained. The figure wore my Green Ranger uniform, my boots, even had my same build and haircut. But something was wrong with its face. It smiled too widely, lips stretched back to reveal far too many teeth than should fit in a human mouth. Its eyes caught the last rays of sunlight and reflected back with an animal-like glow. Rule number 3. The words flashed in my mind like a warning siren. Never acknowledge a second version of yourself if seen. The rule that Aiden Garrison had broken before he disappeared. My heart hammered against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to call for help. Instead, I forced my gaze back down to the sink. My hands shook so badly that water sloshed over the rim as I picked up another plate. Wash, rinse, stack. Don't look up. Don't acknowledge it. I could feel its eyes on me. The weight of that stare pressed against the back of my neck like a physical touch. The urge to look again built with each passing second until it felt like fighting gravity. Just one quick glance, my mind reasoned, just to see if it's still there. I clenched my jaw and kept washing. Another plate, a fork, a knife. My movements mechanical and stiff. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I couldn't resist anymore. I glanced up at the window, praying the thing had gone. It hadn't. It had moved closer. Much closer. Its face now pressed against the glass, mere inches from mine. That impossible smile stretched even wider than before. In the reflection, I could count each of its teeth. Too many. Too sharp. Its eyes locked with mine for a fraction of a second, pupils contracting to pinpoints in the fading light. I dropped the glass I'd been washing. It shattered in the sink, but I barely heard the sound over the blood rushing in my ears. I'd broken the rule. I'd acknowledged it. I'd looked directly at the thing wearing my face. I immediately closed the blinds and retreated to my bedroom after spotting the doppelganger, my heart hammering in my chest as I slammed the bedroom door behind me. The adrenaline made my movements clumsy as I locked the door, though I knew a simple lock wouldn't stop whatever was out there if it really wanted to get in. I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. The silence lasted only seconds before I heard it. Footsteps on the wooden porch outside, circling around the cabin. They weren't hurried or aggressive, just measured and deliberate, like someone taking a casual stroll around my home. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the front door, making me flinch. "Bryson," my own voice called from outside. Not similar, identical. "Bryson, let me in." I slid down to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. This couldn't be happening. "I'm cold out here," my voice continued from beyond the door. "I got locked out somehow. Can you open up?" The pleading sounded so genuine, so human. If I hadn't seen that thing with my own eyes, that twisted smile with too many teeth, those wrong, animal-like eyes, I might have been fooled. "Bryson, please, it's me. The real me." The voice took on a confused, hurt tone. "I don't know what's going on. There's something out here in the woods. I need to get inside." I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voice was too clear, too familiar. My own cadence, my own slight Nashville accent that I'd never fully shaken. The footsteps moved away from the door, circling toward the side of the cabin. I heard a tapping on my bedroom window next, making me scramble away from that wall. "I can see you in there," my voice said, lower now. "Why are you hiding from yourself?" We belong together, Bryson. Let me in. I moved to the center of the room, as far from any walls as possible. The small bedroom offered little refuge. I grabbed my blanket from the bed and wrapped it around myself, as if that could provide any protection. "This isn't funny anymore," the voice called, now taking on an edge of irritation. "Open the door. Now." The last word came out as a bark, harsh and commanding. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to focus on anything else. The feel of the blanket, the sound of my own breathing, anything but that voice. The footsteps continued their circuit around the cabin, pausing at each window, each potential entry point. I heard the back door handle jiggle, then another window being tested. "You know I'm the real one, right?" The voice had softened again, becoming almost conversational. "That thing in there with you, that's the imposter. I'm you, Bryson. The real you, the better you." I glanced at my watch. Only 9:30. The night stretched endlessly ahead. "Remember when Lily left? Remember how she said you were never really there, even when you were right beside her?" The voice had taken on a mocking tone. She was right. "You're not really here, Bryson. You're out here with me." I pressed my hands harder against my ears. How did it know about Lily? About the things she'd said during our last fight? The voice continued, relentless. "Let me in, and we can be whole again. Don't you want to be whole?" Hours passed like this. Sometimes the voice would go quiet for 10 or 15 minutes, making me think, hope, that it had given up. Then it would start again, from a different spot around the cabin. The tone shifted constantly, pleading, reasoning, demanding, threatening. "If you don't let me in now, I'll get in anyway," it hissed around midnight, its voice now coming from the living room window. "And when I do, you'll wish you'd opened the door when I asked nicely." My legs cramped from sitting in one position too long, but I was afraid to move, afraid even to make a sound. I didn't turn on any lights, didn't risk looking out any windows. I just sat there in the dark, listening to my own voice talk to me from outside. "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be," the voice said sometime after 2 a.m. Aiden understood. He let me in. We became one. Don't you want to know what happened to him? That got my attention. Aiden Garrison, the missing ranger, the one who broke rule number 3. "He's still here, you know," the voice continued almost cheerfully. "Part of him anyway, the best part. The part that wasn't afraid." Around 4 a.m, the voice changed tactics. "Your mother would be so disappointed in you," it said, now speaking from near the kitchen. "Hiding in the dark like a child. She raised you to be stronger than this. My mom had died 3 years ago. The cancer took her quickly. I hadn't even had time to fly home before she was gone. She's here too, you know. Everyone who's ever been in these woods and listened to us. They're all here. You could be with her again." I bit my lip until I tasted blood, focusing on that pain instead of the words. The night crawled by. The voice tried everything. Childhood memories, secrets only I should know, promises, threats. Sometimes it would pound on the walls or doors, making the whole cabin shake. Other times it would whisper so quietly I had to strain to hear it, as if it were speaking right into my ear from inside the room. When my watch showed 5:30, I noticed the first hints of gray light through my bedroom window. Dawn was coming. The voice must have noticed too, because it became more urgent, more desperate. "This is your last chance, Bryson. Let me in now, or I'll make sure you never leave these mountains." The footsteps quickened, racing around the cabin, checking every entrance one final time. The voice rose to a shout, then a scream. My scream. But distorted, stretching into something inhuman. And then, as the first proper rays of sunlight broke through the trees, silence fell. Complete, absolute silence. I stayed frozen in place for another hour, not trusting the quiet. Finally, when my watch showed 7 and bright morning light filled the room, I uncurled my stiff limbs and stood on shaky legs. My entire body ached from the night spent huddled on the floor. I moved cautiously to the window and peeked through a crack in the blinds. The clearing looked perfectly normal in the morning light, peaceful even. Birds sang in the trees. A squirrel darted across the open space. There was no sign that anything unusual had happened. I unlocked my bedroom door and crept through the cabin, checking each room, each window, each door. Everything was locked and secure just as I'd left it. There were no footprints outside, no evidence of the night visitor. I made coffee with trembling hands, spilling grounds on the counter. As I waited for it to brew, I took the rules list from the corkboard and read it again, focusing on each item. Rule number 1, never follow voices at night. I'd experienced that one first. Rule number 2, never investigate crying sounds after sunset. That was the second occurrence. Rule number 3, never acknowledge a second version of yourself if seen. I'd broken that one yesterday and paid for it with the most terrifying night of my life. But I was still here, still alive. I'd survived all 3 warnings on the list. I carried my coffee to the kitchen table and sat down, watching the sunlight play across the clearing outside. A strange sense of relief washed over me, mixed with the exhaustion. I knew what I was dealing with now. I'd experienced all 3 phenomena mentioned on the rules list. There were no more surprises waiting for me. At least, none that Leonard had warned about. The thought wasn't as comforting as it should have been. If these 3 horrors were common enough to make it onto an official list, what else might be lurking in these woods that wasn't common enough to mention? I finished my coffee and forced myself to eat a protein bar, though I had no appetite. I had ranger duties to perform, reports to file, trails to check. Normal, everyday tasks that now seemed absurd in the face of what I'd experienced. As I pulled on my uniform and boots, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles shadowed my eyes. My face looked gaunt, the skin pulled tight over my cheekbones. I barely recognized myself. I stepped outside into the morning air, scanning the tree line before I fully emerged from the doorway. The forest looked innocent in the daylight, but I knew better now. I jumped at the snap of a twig, whirled around at the rustle of leaves. Every shadow among the trees seemed to hide something watching me. I checked my watch. 8 a.m., time for my morning radio check-in with Leonard. I returned to the cabin and approached the radio desk, hesitating with my hand on the transmitter. What would I say? That I'd broken rule number 3 and spent the night listening to my own voice trying to trick me into letting it inside? That I was slowly losing my grip on reality? I pressed the transmit button. Station 17 to base, morning check-in. All quiet here. Weather clear, temperature 62 degrees. Over. Leonard's voice crackled back almost immediately. Base to 17, received. Anything to report? Over. I paused, looking out the window at the peaceful forest. Negative. Just another day in paradise. Over and out. I set the receiver down and leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes. I had months left of my assignment. Months of darkness, of voices and crying and things that wore my face. I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. But I was still here. Still alive. And now I knew what to expect. I grabbed my pack and headed out for my morning patrol, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line for movement, my body tense and ready to flee at the slightest provocation. The birds had stopped singing. The forest felt unnaturally still, as if holding its breath, waiting. I checked my map and set off down the eastern trail, jumping at every sound, seeing faces in every pattern of light and shadow among the trees. These encounters were taking their toll. I could feel my nerves fraying, my mind constantly on edge, but I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, just another day as a ranger at Station 17. I started keeping a journal to document the nightly occurrences. It seemed like the only way to maintain my sanity, to transform these terrifying experiences into data points that I could analyze with some emotional distance. I'd found an old leather-bound notebook in the desk drawer, its pages yellowed but blank, as if waiting for my testimony. Tonight I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, reviewing my entries from the past several weeks. The patterns jumped out at me now that I had them written down. The voices, the ones that mimicked Lily and other people I knew, appeared most often during new moons when the night sky was at its darkest. The crying child, that awful sound that still made my chest tighten with instinctive concern, manifested primarily during full moons. The doppelganger, my unwanted twin with too many teeth and those animal eyes, seemed to follow no lunar pattern at all, appearing randomly throughout the month. I flipped through the pages, noting the dates and descriptions. My handwriting had grown increasingly messy as the weeks progressed, mirroring my fraying nerves. But the act of recording these events gave me purpose, a sense that I wasn't just enduring this nightmare, but studying it. Voice incident, I read from an entry 3 weeks back. Called my name for 2 hours, 17 minutes, claimed to be Mom, said she missed me. Voice knew details only she would know. I took a long sip of coffee, grimacing at both the bitter taste and the memory. That night had been particularly brutal. Whatever it was had perfectly mimicked my mother's voice, even the slight rasp she'd developed during her final months of cancer treatment. I'd pressed my hands over my ears until they ached. My most recent entries focused on a new development. During my regular patrols of the eastern boundary trail, I'd discovered strange markings carved into the bark of several old-growth trees. They weren't typical trailblazes or Forest Service markings. These were intricate symbols that resembled nothing I recognized from any guidebook or training manual. I pulled out my digital camera and scrolled through the photos I'd taken. The first marking resembled a spiral with small lines radiating outward, like a stylized sun or star. Another looked like interconnected triangles forming a complex geometric pattern. A third appeared to be some kind of script, but in no language I could identify. These carvings seemed old, the edges weathered, yet they hadn't been completely obscured by the natural growth of the trees. Someone, or something, maintained them. I should radio Leonard about this. That's what protocol dictated for unusual discoveries within my patrol area. But each time I approached the radio desk, my hand hovered over the transmitter before pulling back. What would I say? That I was hearing voices at night and finding weird symbols during the day? That I thought the forest was haunted? That I'd broken rule number 3 and seen my own double watching me from the tree line? No. Leonard would either think I'd lost my mind or, worse, believe me and tell me to pack my things. The assignment would end and I'd be back in Nashville with no job, no home of my own, and the added bonus of nightmares about whatever lived in these woods. I couldn't risk it. Not yet. I closed my journal and stood up, stretching my back. The cabin felt especially small tonight, the walls close. I paced the main room, pausing occasionally to look out the windows at the dark forest beyond. Nothing moved out there, but I knew better than to trust the apparent stillness. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked. One particular board near the stone fireplace made a hollow sound, different from the others. I'd noticed it before but hadn't given it much thought. Tonight, though, with restlessness driving me, I knelt down and examined it more closely. The board was slightly shorter than the others, with a tiny gap at one end. I pressed down on the opposite end, and the board pivoted upward just enough for me to grip it with my fingers. I hesitated, remembering horror movies where the curious protagonist always regretted their discoveries. But curiosity won out. I lifted the board and set it aside. Beneath was a small compartment about 18 inches square and a foot deep. Inside lay several notebooks, stacked neatly and covered with a thin layer of dust. My heart raced as I carefully lifted them out. 5 journals in total, each with a name written on the cover. The most recent bore the name Aiden Garrison in neat block letters. Aiden, the missing ranger, my predecessor. I carried the journals to the kitchen table, arranging them chronologically based on the dates written beside each name. The earliest was from 1978, the latest, Aiden's, ended just 3 months ago. I started with the oldest, belonging to a ranger named Thomas Harwick. His handwriting was tight and precise, the entries methodical. He described many of the same phenomena I'd been experiencing: voices in the night, crying sounds, and sightings of what he called the mimic. He'd also noted the strange tree markings, sketching them with remarkable detail. They matched the ones I'd photographed. The second journal, from the 1980s, contained similar accounts but included a crude map marking locations of the tree carvings. The third and fourth journals continued the pattern, each ranger building on the knowledge of those before, documenting their experiences and observations. By the time I reached Aiden's journal, dawn was still hours away. My eyes burned from reading in the dim light, but I couldn't stop. His entries started professionally enough, similar to my own early ones, but grew increasingly obsessive. He'd connected more dots than his predecessors, tracking the phenomena against lunar cycles, weather patterns, and historical events in the region. His final entries made my blood run cold. Found reference to cave system not on any official maps. He wrote in an entry dated just days before his disappearance. Local history mentions the hollows beneath the Three Sisters peaks where the old ones sleep. Tree markings seem to form a pattern pointing toward the northern ridge. Going to investigate tomorrow despite rules. Need to know what's really happening here. The next day's entry was brief. Located cave entrance behind waterfall on north face. Markings match those on trees. Taking flashlight, rope, and camera. If I don't return, tell Leonard I'm sorry I didn't listen. That was the last entry. The remaining pages were blank. I closed Aiden's journal and sat back, my mind racing. The rules weren't just arbitrary warnings or local superstitions. They were survival tactics, passed down by those who had learned through terrible experience what lurked in these mountains. Each ranger had contributed to this hidden knowledge base, documenting patterns and observations. And each had faced the same choice I now faced: follow the rules and survive, or seek answers and risk everything. I looked at the 5 journals spread before me, physical proof that I wasn't the first to endure these horrors. Others had sat in this very cabin listening to the same voices, seeing the same apparitions. Some had survived their assignments, at least one had not. Outside, the first hints of pre-dawn light touched the eastern sky. I hadn't slept at all, but adrenaline kept me alert. I returned the 4 older journals to their hiding place beneath the floorboard, but kept Aiden's on the table. I needed to study it more carefully, to understand what he'd discovered and where he'd gone wrong. The rules weren't mere folklore. They were a lifeline, written in the collective experience of those who came before me. And Aiden had broken them, not just rule number 3 as Leonard had told me, but the unwritten rule that seemed most important of all. Don't go looking for answers. As morning light filled the cabin, I looked out at the peaceful-seeming forest with new eyes. Something ancient lived in these mountains, something that had been here long before the National Park Service built cabins and carved hiking trails, something that knew how to mimic voices, how to prey on human compassion and curiosity. And I was alone with it for 3 more months. I reached the 5-month mark of my 6-month assignment and noticed the entities growing more aggressive. It wasn't just the frequency of their appearances anymore. Something fundamental had changed in their behavior. They seemed to sense my eventual departure, like predators that could smell when their prey might escape. The first time I heard the voices inside my closet, I was changing my shirt after returning from a particularly muddy patrol of the eastern boundary. A whisper, barely audible, came from between my hanging clothes. "Bryson, we're waiting." I stumbled backwards, slamming the closet door shut and pressing my back against it. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The rules had never mentioned this. The voices were supposed to stay outside. That was the deal. The unspoken arrangement that had kept me alive these past months. They stayed out there. I stayed in here. But the rules were changing. That night, I dragged my dresser in front of the closet door. I slept with my flashlight clutched in my hand, though I knew light did nothing against them. It was just something solid to hold on to while the whispers continued from behind the barricaded door, discussing me as if I couldn't hear them. He thinks he's leaving soon. He thinks he'll get away, like the others thought. 3 days later, I was eating a can of beans at my kitchen table when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of an infant crying. Not from outside the cabin as before, not circling the perimeter as it had done for months, but directly beneath me, under the floorboards, so close it might as well have been in the room. I set my fork down and stared at the wooden planks beneath my feet. The crying continued, a helpless, mewling sound that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of my boots. I knew there was no basement, no crawl space, just hard earth and whatever else might exist in the darkness below. I stood up and backed away, but the crying followed, tracking my movements as if whatever made the sound could sense exactly where I stood. I retreated to my bed that night, pulling my feet up off the floor, curled into a ball on top of the blankets. The crying continued until dawn, coming from directly beneath my mattress. The doppelganger was the worst. During my 4th month, it had only appeared at dusk or dawn, liminal times when the light played tricks. But as I entered my 5th month, it grew bold. I spotted it watching me from the tree line at noon on a bright, clear day. My exact double, wearing my uniform, my face, but with that too wide smile that stretched beyond human limits. I was marking trail conditions on my map, standing in a small clearing a half-mile from the cabin, when I felt eyes on me. I looked up, and there it was, partially hidden behind a thick oak trunk, watching me. When it realized I'd spotted it, it stepped fully into view, its smile widening impossibly. It raised one hand and waved at me, a cheerful, friendly gesture that made my stomach turn. I pretended not to see it, looking back down at my map, but I could feel its stare boring into me. When I risked another glance, it had moved closer, now only 30 yards away. I packed up my gear with shaking hands and hurried back toward the cabin, never looking back, though I could sense it following at a distance. That night, I pulled Aiden's journal from its hiding place under my mattress and reread his entries, looking for anything that might explain why the entities were growing more aggressive. Had the same thing happened to him near the end of his assignment? But Aiden's notes focused more on his growing obsession with the cave system he'd discovered, his conviction that he could find answers there. I traced my finger over his final entry, the one where he described finding the cave entrance behind the waterfall on the north face. The page was water-stained, the ink blurred in places, but his excitement was clear in the hurried handwriting. Found it. The entrance is just as the markings indicated, behind the falls on the north face of the Middle Sister. The symbols carved around the opening match those on the trees exactly. I'm going in tomorrow with rope, my camera, and extra batteries. If what I suspect is true, this could explain everything. The voices, the mimic, all of it. Sorry, Leonard. I know what the rules say, but some questions need answers. The next page was blank. Like his life, the journal simply stopped. I closed the book and tucked it back into its hiding place. 5 months down, 1 to go. I just had to hold on, follow the rules, and wait for Leonard to come get me. I could make it. I had to. But that night, everything changed. I was washing my dinner plate when I heard a voice from the bedroom. My mother's voice, though she'd been dead for years. "Bryson, honey, are you there? I need to talk to you." Before I could react, a child's cry erupted from the front porch, not distant, not circling, but right there, as if someone had left an infant on my doorstep. Then came the pounding, heavy fists hammering on my kitchen window. I turned to see my own face pressed against the glass, that inhuman smile stretched across it, teeth too numerous and sharp to be human. "Let me in, Bryson," it called in my voice. "It's cold out here." I dropped the plate into the sink and backed away. For the first time since I'd arrived, all three manifestations had appeared simultaneously. This had never happened before. The rules didn't cover this scenario. The crying grew louder, more desperate. My mother's voice called out questions about why I was ignoring her. The pounding on the windows intensified, moving from one to another as the doppelganger circled the cabin. I retreated to the bathroom, the only room without windows, and locked the door behind me. I slid down against it until I sat on the cold tile floor, pulling my knees to my chest. The voices followed me, now seeming to come from inside the bathroom walls themselves. "Why are you hiding from us, Bryson?" my mother asked, her voice coming from near the shower drain. "We just want to be with you," said Lily's voice from behind the mirror. "Don't you want to know the truth?" my own voice asked from the other side of the door. I covered my ears, but it did nothing to block the sounds. The crying child seemed to be right outside the bathroom door now, its wails rising and falling in an unnatural rhythm. With trembling hands, I pulled Aiden's journal and the station rules list from my pocket. I'd taken to carrying both with me at all times, like talismans. I unfolded the rules list, though I knew every word by heart. 1. Never follow voices at night. 2. Never investigate crying sounds after sunset. 3. Never acknowledge a second version of yourself if seen. Simple rules, life-saving rules, but they didn't tell me what to do when all three phenomena converged, when the entities no longer played by their own rules. I opened Aiden's journal again, flipping to the final pages. In the dim light of the bathroom, I reread his description of the cave entrance. He'd included coordinates, precise directions. I could find it if I wanted to. I could go there, see what he saw, maybe find a way to end this nightmare once and for all. The thought was tempting, so tempting that for a moment I actually considered it. What if there was a way to stop these things? What if Aiden had been right, and the answers were waiting in that cave? But then I remembered. Aiden never came back. The pounding on the bathroom door started then, so violent that the wood flexed inward with each impact. "We know you're thinking about the cave," my doppelganger's voice said, no longer sounding exactly like mine. There was something else underneath it now, something ancient and hungry. "We can show you the way. We can show you what Aiden found." The crying changed, too, transforming into a high-pitched keening that no human infant could make. My mother's voice distorted, dropping in pitch until it became a guttural growl. "One more month," I whispered to myself. "Just one more month." I pressed my back against the door, bracing my feet against the bathtub to help hold it closed as the pounding intensified. The entire cabin seemed to shake with each impact. I clutched the journal and rules list to my chest like a shield, though I knew they offered no real protection. Through that endless night, I sat in the dark as the cabin was circled by things that shouldn't exist. Things that wore familiar faces and spoke with familiar voices but were neither human nor natural. I listened to them call to me, threaten me, plead with me. I heard them testing every entrance, every possible way into the cabin and into me. And I endured. I didn't open the door. I didn't answer their calls. I didn't look for the cave. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the small bathroom vent, the noises began to fade. The pounding stopped first, then the crying, and finally the voices, retreating like a tide pulling back from shore. I waited a full hour after complete silence before I unlocked the bathroom door. My legs were numb from sitting in the same position all night, and my back ached from pressing against the hard wood. I stumbled into the main room of the cabin, half expecting to find it destroyed. But everything was exactly as I'd left it. My half-washed dinner plate still sat in the sink. My coffee mug remained on the counter. Not a single item was out of place. Only the deep scratches on the outside of the bathroom door, scratches no human fingernails could have made, proved that the night had been real. I made fresh coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, spilling grounds across the counter. As I waited for it to brew, I stared out at the peaceful morning forest. Birds sang. Sunlight dappled the clearing. Nothing moved at the tree line. One more month. I just had to survive one more month. I completed the 6-month assignment by following every rule exactly as written. The last night had been the worst yet. Voices from every corner of the cabin, crying that seemed to come from inside the walls, and my doppelganger pounding on every window simultaneously. But I'd made it. I'd survived. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as I packed my few belongings into the same duffel bag and 2 boxes I'd arrived with. My hands still shook slightly as I folded my clothes, the tremor a constant companion these past months. I caught a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror. Gaunt face, dark circles under my eyes, hair longer and more unkempt than I'd ever worn it. I barely recognized myself. I heard the rumble of an engine outside and looked through the window. Leonard's Forest Service truck pulled into the clearing, kicking up dust that caught the morning light. I took a deep breath and grabbed my bags, taking one final look around the cabin. The rules list was still pinned above the radio desk where I'd left it. I considered taking it as a souvenir, but decided against it. Those rules belonged here, in this place. I stepped outside as Leonard cut the engine. The forest was quiet this morning, peaceful as if nothing had ever happened. As if I hadn't spent countless nights huddled in terror while things that shouldn't exist tormented me from the darkness. "Morning," Leonard called as he climbed out of his truck. His weathered face looked exactly the same as it had 6 months ago, as if time worked differently for him. "Morning," I replied, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. I hadn't spoken much these past months, just the bare minimum during radio check-ins. Leonard walked up to me, his eyes scanning my face. "Jesus, Weber, you look terrible." I shrugged and set my bags down on the porch. "I followed the rules." Leonard nodded approvingly, his expression softening slightly. "That's why you're still alive, unlike Aiden Garrison." The name sent a chill through me. I'd spent months with Aiden's journal under my mattress, reading his final entries over and over. I knew what had happened to him, or at least what he thought was going to happen. The cave behind the waterfall, the symbols matching the tree carvings, his final apology to Leonard. "You want some help with those?" Leonard gestured to my bags. "Sure." I handed him the smaller box, and he took it to his truck. We loaded my things in silence. The entire clearing felt charged with unspoken knowledge. Things Leonard knew but wouldn't say. Things I'd experienced but couldn't explain. As I placed the last box in the truck bed, Leonard leaned against the driver's side door and looked at me thoughtfully. "You know, Weber, I've been impressed with your work here," he said. "Your reports were always on time, trails were maintained properly. You did good." "Thanks," I said, not knowing what else to add. I hadn't come here to be a model ranger. I'd come here to escape, to rebuild after my divorce and job loss. Instead, I'd found something far worse than heartbreak or unemployment. "I'd like to offer you the ranger position permanently," Leonard continued. "Good rangers who follow instructions are hard to find." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Stay here? In this cabin? With the voices and the crying and my smiling doppelganger waiting in the trees? "The pay's better for permanent staff," Leonard added when I didn't respond. "And you've already got experience with the unique challenges of Station 17. I turned and looked back at the cabin one final time. In the morning light, it looked almost charming. the kind of rustic getaway city people pay good money to visit. But I knew what waited when darkness fell. I knew what lurked in the hollows beneath the Three Sisters peaks, what carved symbols into ancient trees, what mimicked the voices of loved ones to lure you out into the night. "I've had enough solitude for one lifetime," I said finally, turning back to Leonard. "I think I'll pass." Leonard nodded, not looking surprised. "Fair enough. Not everyone's cut out for long-term postings out here." He pulled his keys from his pocket. "Ready to go?" I climbed into the passenger seat of his truck, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders as he started the engine. The cabin grew smaller in the side mirror as we drove away, the trees gradually closing around it until it disappeared from view altogether. We drove in silence for several miles, the narrow dirt road eventually widening as we approached the main park road. Leonard turned on the radio, tuning it to a country station that played songs about normal human problems: broken hearts, lost jobs, unpaid bills, problems that now seemed quaint compared to what I'd faced. "Your truck's still at the main office," Leonard said as we reached the paved road. "Battery might be dead after sitting so long, but we can jump it." I nodded, watching the trees pass by outside the window. They looked like ordinary trees now, no carvings, no symbols, no faces hiding in the patterns of bark and shadow. When we reached the ranger headquarters, Leonard helped me jumpstart my old Ford pickup. The engine turned over after a few tries, rumbling to life as if no time had passed. "Take care of yourself, Weber," Leonard said, offering his hand. I shook it, noticing how normal his grip felt. Just flesh and bone, nothing more. "You too, Leonard." As I drove down the mountain road toward civilization, I watched the great Smoky Mountains recede in my rearview mirror. I was alive but forever changed by my encounter with whatever ancient things called those mountains home. The rules had saved my life, even if I would never understand why they were necessary. I turned on the radio, letting the music drown out my thoughts as the road curved downward toward towns and cities and people. My hands still shook slightly on the steering wheel, and I knew they might never stop. Some part of me would always be back in that cabin, listening for voices in the night. Some questions were better left unanswered, and some places were better left to those entities that had claimed them long before humans arrived. I didn't know what lived in those mountains, what had taken Aiden Garrison, what had tormented me for 6 months, and I didn't want to know. The mountains disappeared behind me as the road straightened out. Ahead lay gas stations, restaurants, grocery stores, the mundane world I'd once taken for granted. I rolled down the window, letting the wind rush over my face, carrying away the whispers that still echoed in my mind. I was going home, wherever that might be now. I was alive, and for the moment, that was enough.